Our oceans are a vast landscape filled with unknown creatures of all shapes and sizes. For hundreds of years, mankind have explored, researched, and discovered thousands of species of animals, and we truly have not even come close to discovering everything down there. Every year, new animals and creatures are discovered, which begs the question, what are we missing? And will we ever truly know what's living down there? Stories and legends of great monsters have been prevalent throughout history, coming from those brave enough to endure the dangerous waters of our oceans. Some legends the sailors and fishermen would come back telling would be so horrifying and so unbelievable, it would cause curious explorers to embark on their own quests to find the truth. Explorers and storytellers have told tales of one giant legendary beast swimming in the cold waters of Norway. One so large, it could bring down giant warships and disguise itself as an island. Today, we'll be looking into the Legend of the Kraken. Welcome everyone to Moonlight Lore. I'm your host, Jordan Hopkins. Today we'll be talking about one of the largest monsters known in folklore and legends, the Kraken. Though stories of the Kraken are known worldwide, traces of the original tale comes to us from ancient Norway, dating back to between the 12th and 13th century. The first tales referring to this nautical Goliath don't actually mention the name Kraken. The tales more so refer to a creature called the Hafgufa, who would later be interpreted to being the Kraken hundreds of years later. In the saga of Orvar Odd, we find the protagonist Odd sailing on a voyage seeking vengeance against the man who had killed his blood brother. During his voyage, Odd, his son Vignir, and their crew encountered two large creatures, the sea reek and the heatherback, who would both later become known as the Hafgufa and the Lindback. Quoting Vignir, as he describes seeing the two creatures, he says, "These two sea monsters, one called Sea Reek and the other Heatherback. The Sea Reek is the biggest monster in the whole ocean. It swallows men and ships, and whales too, and anything else around. It stays underwater for days, and when it puts up its mouth and nostrils for air, it never stays on the surface for less than one tide. During this time, it would attack ships, swallow men, and then disappear. And if it could not find a ship to wreck or men to eat, it would feast on whales and anything else unfortunate enough to be in its territory." The Hafgufa and the Lindback were said to both have been able to disguise themselves as islands and rocks jutting out of the water, luring men and ships to investigate the out-of-place land masses. The two were so large, no one was ever able to see their full size, giving them the appearance of being large islands when they would emerge from the water for breaths of air. With the legend of the Hafgufa and the Lindback being two of the earliest notes of what our modern-day Kraken possibly could be, we can then look for more stories about these creatures and learn what makes these two so amazing. During near the same time the saga of Orvar Odd came into being, an educational text called the King's Mirror was written around the year 1250. In these texts, it covers many different topics from the surrounding natural world of Norway, to the king's court, and to the spiritual truths and practices. The first chapter, The Merchant and the Natural World, we can get some insight on landmasses near Norway like Iceland, Ireland, and Greenland. Included in this section of the text, there is a part also discussing about local animals, whales, fish, and of course, the Kraken. Described in the text, it tells us very few men could give a definite answer to the Kraken's true size, for it's only been seen by a few on the account that it never approached the shore and only appeared in open waters where sailors and fishermen could see it. On the occasion of when men had seen it, they described the creature as more of an island than any kind of known fish. With it being so large, it was believed there could have only been two swimming in the seas at one time, as the amount of fish required to feed the kraken would have been immense. It was said when the kraken wished to feed, it would open its mouth and give out a violent belch. The smaller fish would then swarm the area, attracted to the smell and taste of the kraken in the water. They would then crowd in front and into its open mouth to be swallowed whole. With the two first recordings of the kraken being quite detailed, very early on in the legend we can get an idea of what we're dealing with. Though one could say with the saga of Orvar Odd being an enjoyed story, one might think it might have been added into the educational text of the King's Mirror to provide a sense of entertainment to the higher class and to encourage those willing to learn and investigate more of the world around them. But whatever might have been the case back then, the legend continues long past the 13th century and into the 18th century, where we pick up with a man named Eric Pontoppidan who studies the kraken. In 1751, Eric Pontoppidan, a Danish-Norwegian historian and author, started to gather collections of stories from sailors and fishermen who had claimed to have seen the kraken. According to the fishermen, they were never able to see the full size of the creature due to its immense size. Although the fishermen were never able to get a full view of the kraken, they would later estimate from the parts of the kraken they could see protruding from the surface of the water that it would have had to been roughly 1.5 miles large, if not larger. The fishermen reported it never really attacked them unless it was surfacing or descending back into the water. When it would surface, it would easily push boats and ships out of the way, and due to its size, the waves it would cause from moving around in the water would inadvertently capsize smaller boats. When it would descend, it would displace so much water that it would cause more waves, or even whirlpools, which would then carry the boats and ships along with it, causing them to crash into one another or even sink among the waves, leading Pontoppidan to believe this does make the kraken dangerous, but not as malicious as one would initially think. And despite knowing the risk to their lives and their boats, the fishermen would deliberately station their boats above the kraken to catch their day's worth of fish. With the kraken being such a rare creature to find, it was only spotted a few days of the year. If you could find the kraken, you could find the fish, so the sailors and fishermen needed a way to track the kraken. Just like in the King's Mirror text, the fishermen and Pontoppidan described how the kraken was able to lure thousands of fish to it in order to feed itself. While it traveled through the ocean, the kraken would excrete a dark, thick mucus trailing behind it. Fish of all kinds would then smell the excretion and follow the trail to where the kraken would be waiting for them. The sailors and fishermen had learned by following the large schools of traveling fish, or by trying to follow the smell of the mucus in the water, they were sure to come across the kraken eventually, and their main prize, the thousands of fish gathering around the beast, would be then waiting for them. When the fishermen finally made it to the place where the kraken was lingering, they would sail or row their boats into position over top of the kraken, waiting underneath the water for the fish to gather. With the thousands of fish gathering between the kraken and the surface of the water feasting on the mucus, the fishermen would then cast their nets out into the water, catching hundreds of fish with each throw. In the eyes of the fishermen, the reward would outweigh the risk. During the feeding frenzy, the smell of the kraken and fish would become unbearable. The mucus in the water would stick to the fishermen's boats the entire day and would be near impossible to scrape off until they arrived back in port. When they arrived back into port with the haul of fish, every boat with mucus on it had to be peeled and scraped clean to avoid the rancid smell from lingering in the air and around their boats. So as the kraken lured fish within its vicinity, the fishermen who were nearby had to be on constant alert for movement, lest the kraken emerge from below, capsizing their boats and swallowing any unfortunate sailor trapped in the mucus. The mucus and thousands of fish in the water made it near impossible to see the kraken, so the fishermen needed a way to keep an eye on it so they could quickly move their boats if the kraken decided to rise from the depths. The technique the fishermen used was called lead lining. Typically, lead lining was used in a way to measure where reefs and shorelines were to determine if it was safe for boats and ships to pass through an area. But in this case, it was used to determine the depth of the Kraken. What would be done is someone on the boat would have a length of rope with a lead weight tied to the end. Along the rope, and at different lengths, they would tie colored ribbons to it. When the lead weight was dropped into the water, it would cause the rope to sink into the water, and as the lead landed on the ground, or in this case, landed on the Kraken, the colored ribbon still above the water would then tell the men how deep the lead weight had gone. The fishermen told Pontoppidan the Kraken would typically suspend itself below 50 fathoms while waiting for the fish to gather. But when the man holding the rope felt it give more slack, he knew the Kraken was starting to rise and in turn told the others they needed to move the boats out of the way. As the fishermen sailed or rowed away, the Kraken would then rise. According to the fishermen, it would rise with its back coming out of the water, first giving off the appearance of a large island emerging from the water. The fish would then become trapped on the back of the Kraken, and as they would flop around trying to make it back to the water, the horns would appear. Eric Pontoppidan would go on to describe the multiple horns the fishermen saw as towering masses emerging from the water, rising to the size of ship masts. Pontoppidan theorized that these were the creature's arms, and how it would be able to move itself through the ocean so easily. Once the Kraken's arms were raised to their full height, they would slowly submerge again, creating large waves and whirlpools, which would then drag everything unfortunate enough to get trapped in the flowing water to be sucked down into the Kraken's open beak. Pontoppidan recalls of an instance of a small fishing boat not rowing far enough away from the feeding Kraken and was caught in the moving whirlpool. The two fishermen in the boat struggled to row out of the rushing water, but they weren't strong enough to combat the currents. As the Kraken lowered down its arms, it crushed the front of their boat, causing the two men to fall out, clinging to the remains of their wreckage, lost at sea until they were found by another passing ship. As the years go by, sightings of the Kraken seem to appear less and less, until one day Pontoppidan discovers another story written by a Reverend Friss in 1680. Reverend Friss was out on one of his daily strolls on the small island where he lived, and as he walked along the cliffside overlooking the ocean, he picked up on a strange smell coming from the nearby cove. As Reverend Friss got closer, he covered his face with his handkerchief, but it couldn't cover up the stench of what was hiding just beyond. A young Kraken was trapped in the water between the rocks and cliffs trying to escape, and as Reverend Friss looked at it in astonishment, it looked as though the small Kraken had got itself tangled among the low roots of the nearby trees. Reverend Friss returned to his town to tell the townsfolk what he had found on his walk, and a large group of people left town to marvel at the strange creature. Of course, at this point, none of the townfolk, including Reverend Friss, had no clue what kind of creature they were looking at, as no one has ever seen a small Kraken or one so close to land. As the days went by, and the creature still hadn't gotten itself free from its prison, and as no one could stand the smell or dared to risk go climb down to help the monster, it slowly died among the rocks and began to decompose where it lied. Not helping the struggling creature while it was still alive was evidently a mistake, as it took weeks to fully decompose and plaguing the surrounding area with an unbearable stench for months. Pontoppidan realized, even though some of the stories he was reading about never actually mentions the Kraken by name, but more so just about tales of unknown behemoths of the sea that appear throughout history, Pontoppidan believes some of the creatures, although not called the Kraken, could have been related in some way. Sometime during the 9th century, St. Brendan of Ireland was on a journey with his crew to the Isle of the Blessed. As his ship sailed through the North Atlantic Ocean, it came upon a group of uncharted islands. St. Brendan and his monks approached the islands, but unlike his enthusiastic crew who were delighted to step off their boat and stretch their legs for a moment, St. Brendan was skeptical of these strange islands. The crew dropped anchor and flocked off the ship to set up camp before night came about. But as he was unloading his belongings, St. Brennan received a vision from God, warning him to sleep on the boat that night. So he told his crew to sleep on board the ship with him, rather than sleeping on these strange islands. But the men refused, for they have been on their voyage far too many days to pass off the opportunity to sleep on solid ground. Trusting in his faith in God, St. Brennan decided to sleep on the boat and to give up his desire to sleep on land with his crew. Though he relented and allowed his monks and crew to sleep on the island, just as a precaution, he told them they mustn't wander far and to sleep near the boat that night. During the night, St. Brennan laid down his weary head to rest, and his crew stayed up telling stories, drinking, and eating around the burning campfire. The fire burned, and as the men slowly drifted off to sleep, the ground began to move out from underneath them. The men quickly scrambled to their feet, yelling questions to one another, trying to figure out what was happening. St. Brennan was awoken from his sleep to the loud screams of his friends and rushed out of his cabin to the side rail of the ship, where he saw the island beginning to sink right before his very eyes. As he watched his men run towards the ship, he noticed the surrounding islands began to move as well. Some sank below the water, while others rised up. This was when Brendan knew this was no island at all. It was actually a large beast. The monks and the crew fell into the water as the surface they were running on sank below. St. Brennan rushed to save his friends by jumping into the water himself to reach those who had difficulty swimming. The frantic men climbed up on the ship ladders and boarded safely, where they would stand and watch the enormous body of this monster sink below the surface and swim off into the abyss. Later, while thinking back to this encounter, St. Brennan mentions he believed the creature to have been the great monster Jasconus, a legendary beast described to look similar to a whale and a turtle, with a body so large it would have sand dunes, rocks, and even plant life growing on its back. The legend of Jasconus describes this monster the same way the Kraken is also described when it comes to eating and luring fish. It would give off a very sweet scent into the water for fish to follow and to consume its mucus. As the fish were surrounding by the thousands, Jasconus would rise up, trapping its prey upon its back and waiting for them to fall down into its mouth. For hundreds of years, tales of sea monsters and legendary beasts have come out of nearly every single culture around the globe. These sea creatures, although magnificent, were most likely exaggerated at some points. As I like to do during these episodes, I like to find some sort of explanation or similarity to another creature that may help shed light on what these people hundreds of years ago might have actually been seeing. Now, what most historians and scientists believe to be the cause of Kraken sightings are actually pods of whales swimming together, or more likely, colossal or giant squids, since they hunt and look like what the Kraken was described as. A pod of whales, while seen swimming near the surface of the water, may have been mistaken for one giant creature swimming. As whales live and travel together, seeing these massive animals traveling, spread out among the waters, could have given sailors with more active imaginations back then to believe instead of seeing a group of smaller animals, they could have imagined they were seeing an animal such as the Kraken. Now, with this being said, some whales like the humpback sleep near or at the surface of the water for a short time in order for it to breathe. Perhaps instances of pods of whales sleeping near the surface could have been mistaken for islands made by the Kraken. Others have theorized the Kraken could have been the carcass of dead whales, floating on the surface of the water, gases inside keeping it afloat, and when the gas escapes the dead body, it would cause a terrible stench, allowing the whale carcass to sink beneath the water. With the documented discoveries of the colossal squid in 1924 and the giant squid in the early 2000s, scientists and historians gather these animals would have been more likely to have been mistaken for the Kraken hundreds of years ago. We can see, since these two giant animals were only recently discovered within the last 100 years or so, just goes to show how elusive sea creatures truly are. Now, between the colossal and giant squids, the giant squid is the one we're going to look at specifically, since the colossal squid inhabits the southern waters of Antarctica, while the giant squid inhabits Arctic waters, most notably near Greenland, Iceland, and Norway. While many reports of the giant squid say they're well over 20 meters in length, those which have been documented are found to be roughly around 5 meters in length. But when measured in post-mortem, when the body of the squid is much more relaxed, they can be found to exceed 10 meters in length, and their weight is estimated to be around 300 kilograms. Taking into account their massive size and curious nature, it wouldn't be surprising to believe people a few hundred years ago first seeing one of these creatures would mistake it for a strange monster. As most squids typically don't come near the surface of the water, sightings of the giant squid would have been extremely rare. And as I said before, the giant squid was only recently documented, proving it to be an actual living creature and not just a story from those who have claimed to have seen it. Depictions of the giant squid give us a glimpse of what people a few hundred years ago believed what the giant squid was like, as many were of the squid rivaling the size of a merchant ship, or of the squid attacking the ship itself. Since these depictions are from a few hundred years ago before the giant squid was documented, we can be certain these creatures have been seen and been around long enough for people to create fantastical stories of these mysterious sea creatures. Going back to the stories of the Kraken stalking the ocean hundreds of years ago, we might be able to find some similarities linking the giant squid to being the culprit of this legendary beast. The horns, or the arms Pontoppidan described as the way the Kraken would catch its prey and move around in the water, could have been the tentacles of the giant squid rising out of the water. Notes made of the strong and massive arms of the Kraken could have also been the suction cups of the giant squid's tentacles, able to grab hold of its prey or the hull of the boat with ease. Another similarity the two creatures could hold would be the dark mucus the Kraken was said to excrete and the dark ink the giant squid is able to excrete when threatened. Perhaps the sailors and fishermen confused the dark ink of the squid as a mucus and theorized the Kraken gave off this mucus to attract fish, when instead they just got too close with their boats and the giant squid felt threatened by their presence and discharged its supply of ink. Although these few similarities and its appearance seem to be enough to convince many that the Kraken was just a giant squid, the giant squid is nowhere near 1.5 miles long and in no way could be compared to an island. Depending on the size of the boat, if it's just a small fishing rowboat, then yes, a giant squid could cause damage to it, but compared to a merchant vessel or a man-of-war ship, the giant squids would not have the size or strength to attack or destroy one. With the giant squid typically found in deeper waters, and it very rarely coming near the surface to hunt for food, usually the only time a giant squid is near the surface is when it feels as though it's about to die, or if the fish population is low and they come near the surface looking for more to eat. The mucus the Kraken gave off, according to the stories, will not be like the ink given off by the giant squid either. The mucus was said to have been thick, sticky, and smelled horrible. The squid ink, though thick, is not like mucus. The squid uses its ink to escape predators, meaning the viscosity of the ink needs to be low enough for the squid to swim through. The ink itself, to my knowledge, doesn't have such a strong scent like the mucus the Kraken excreted either, as many people use the squid ink to enhance their meals for flavor. But don't get me wrong, squid ink does smell. But if fishermen back then, who were surrounded by fish all day, said that the smell was unbearable, then comparing it to the smell the Kraken would give off, it would just not be the same. The differences between the Kraken and the giant squid seem to outweigh the similarities by a large margin. With only a few aspects of the giant squid being similar to the Kraken, I would argue the giant squid is not the culprit we're looking for as to what the Kraken truly was. Whatever one chooses to believe, we have no idea if the Kraken was a living, breathing creature swimming in our oceans hundreds of years ago. We don't actually know for sure what Reverend Friss, St. Brennan, or all those fishermen actually saw back then. Whether it be the Kraken, the Hafgufa, Lindback, or just Conus, stories of unfathomable giant sea creatures seem to be a prevalent theme among hundreds of civilizations across time and across the world. The mystery of the Kraken being a real living creature will probably never be solved. However, it does live on through stories, legends, and pop culture we all enjoy hundreds of years after the first sightings of it appearing. Even today, with modern advancements in technology, we still have no idea what really could be down there. waiting just below the surface of the water.